"Be quiet," the homeless man whispered, his voice barely louder than the rustle of newspaper beneath his shoes. And for a moment Daniel Whitmore almost kept walking, almost dismissed the words as another stray sound in a city that never stopped talking. But something in the man's eyes made him hesitate, just long enough for the morning air to shift around them like a held breath. The street outside Whitmore Financial Tower was already alive with the polished rhythm of downtown Chicago, black SUVs idling along the curb, the scent of roasted coffee drifting from a cafe on the corner, heels tapping against concrete in quick, confident beats. And Daniel stepped out of his town car with the practiced calm of someone used to controlling every second of his day. His charcoal suit pressed perfectly, his silver watch catching the pale sunlight. His assistant speaking quietly through his earpiece about a $12 million acquisition scheduled for 9:30 a.m., and he nodded slightly as he walked, eyes forward, never looking down, never looking sideways, never noticing the man sitting near the newspaper stand until that voice reached him again. Softer this time, steady and careful. "Sir, be quiet." And Daniel frowned, slowing his stride as security shifted immediately, one guard stepping forward with measured professionalism, ready to move the homeless man away. But the man didn't reach out, didn't step closer. He simply lifted his head, his dark eyes focused not on Daniel's suit or his watch, but somewhere beyond him. As if listening to something no one else could hear, Marcus Reed had been sitting on that corner since dawn, wrapped in a faded navy jacket that had once belonged to someone else, his boots worn but neatly tied, a paper cup resting beside him with only 2 quarters glinting at the bottom. And yet there was nothing desperate about the way he sat, nothing frantic in the way he watched the street. He studied movement, shadows, reflections in glass windows, the small details most people ignored, the kind of details you learn to notice when you spend years outdoors, when the city becomes both your shelter and your warning system. And now his head tilted slightly, his brow tightening as he listened again. Daniel's guard stepped forward. "Sir, let's keep moving." But Daniel didn't move. Something about the man's calm unsettled him, the absence of panic, the quiet certainty. Marcus raised one finger gently, not demanding, not rude, just a simple request for silence. And the morning noise seemed to soften around them. A delivery truck rolled slowly past. The light changed from red to green. A breeze moved through the narrow canyon of buildings, and Marcus's gaze lifted toward the tall glass facade above the sidewalk, his shoulders still, his breathing steady, and Daniel followed his eyes for the first time, glancing upward, not yet understanding why, only sensing the strange stillness that had settled between them, like the city itself was pausing, waiting for something neither of them could yet see. Marcus Reed had learned long ago that the city spoke in quiet signals long before anything changed. The faint tremor of metal against metal, the whisper of loose fixtures shifting in the wind, the subtle hum that most people filtered out without even realizing it. And now that hum rested faintly in the air above them, thin but steady, like a distant vibration traveling through glass and steel. Marcus remained seated on the cold concrete, his shoulders slightly hunched inside his worn navy jacket, his hands resting loosely on his knees. But his attention sharpened, focused, the way it used to when he worked construction sites years earlier, before the layoffs, before the hospital bills, before the long chain of quiet losses that slowly pushed him from job sites to shelters and finally to this corner of Wacker Drive, where he had spent the past 2 winters watching the river freeze and thaw again. He had once been a maintenance technician for high-rise buildings, the kind of work that taught you how structures breathed in wind, how loose bolts whispered before they shifted, how tension moved through steel frames like a quiet warning. And those instincts never left him. Even after 3 years of sleeping under an overpass and collecting discarded coffee cups for warmth, Marcus tilted his head slightly, listening again, while Daniel Whitmore stood beside him, irritation slowly mixing with curiosity, his assistant's voice still murmuring faintly in his earpiece about market projections and investor calls. But Daniel barely registered the words now, his attention drifting upward, following the homeless man's gaze toward the towering glass facade reflecting pale morning sunlight across the sidewalk. Security shifted uncomfortably beside them, unsure whether to guide Daniel forward or wait, and pedestrians flowed around them in smooth Practiced lines, a woman in running shoes passed with a coffee in hand. A courier balanced two boxes against his shoulder. A taxi rolled slowly past. Yet Marcus remained still, his eyes tracking something subtle above. A faint shimmer of movement near a large metal signage panel mounted along the building's overhang, nearly 20 feet above the entrance. The breeze strengthened slightly, brushing along the street like a cool ribbon of air. And Marcus felt the vibration again, barely audible. A faint metallic rattle that blended into the city noise but stood out to someone trained to hear it. His fingers tightened slightly against his knees, not in fear, just recognition. Daniel glanced at his watch, then back upward, noticing for the first time how the sunlight reflected unevenly along the metal panel, the edge shifting almost imperceptibly with the wind. Marcus spoke again quietly, his voice calm and measured. "Sir, just wait a second." Daniel frowned, and used to taking instructions from anyone, especially a man sitting beside a paper cup with loose change. Yet something in Marcus's tone felt grounded, certain, and for the first time that morning Daniel Whitmore stood still without checking his phone, without stepping forward, simply watching the building above as the breeze passed again, slightly stronger now, and the faint metallic sound returned, thin as a whisper, carried down between the glass towers. Marcus exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the structure above, while the city around them continued moving, unaware that something subtle, something almost invisible, was quietly shifting overhead. Daniel Whitmore was not a man who waited for uncertainty. His entire life had been built on calculated movement, fast decisions, and controlled environments where nothing unexpected slipped through the cracks. And yet he stood there now, still beside a homeless man whose quiet presence felt strangely anchored in a world that usually moved around him. The wind brushed again between the tall buildings, carrying the scent of fresh asphalt and roasted coffee, and Daniel adjusted his cuff slightly, a habit he had developed during tense negotiations. His security team exchanged brief glances, uncertain whether to intervene, but Daniel raised a subtle hand without looking at them, signaling them to hold back. His eyes followed the faint movement above, noticing the metal signage panel mounted along the building entrance, its brushed aluminum surface reflecting thin streaks of sunlight, and for the first time, he realized how high it hung, nearly 20 feet above the sidewalk, secured by a series of brackets that looked solid at a distance, but seemed less certain now that he studied them carefully. Marcus Reed shifted slightly on the concrete, not standing, not drawing attention, just watching with the patience of someone used to long, quiet hours, his mind recalling old job sites, steel beams humming in strong winds, scaffolding bolts loosening after winter freezes, the kind of details he once checked before supervisors even asked. And now the faint vibration returned again, subtle but consistent, like a loose coin rolling slowly across a table. Marcus narrowed his eyes, following the edge of the metal panel where the sunlight flickered unevenly. Daniel glanced at him briefly, noticing the calm focus, the absence of panic, and it unsettled him more than alarm would have, because panic could be dismissed. But calm suggested certainty. A courier pushing a hand truck passed between them, wheels rattling softly across the sidewalk, and the faint metallic sound above blended with the movement below, almost impossible to distinguish unless someone was listening for it. Marcus spoke quietly again, his tone steady, not urgent, just grounded. "Sir, sometimes the city gives you a warning before something shifts." Daniel did not respond immediately. He simply kept looking upward, his breathing slower now, the conversation in his earpiece fading into background noise. The morning sun brightened slightly, reflecting across the glass windows of the tower, and the breeze strengthened once more, brushing against the metal signage panel. The edge trembled almost imperceptibly, a tiny movement, no more than an inch, but enough for Marcus to notice. His fingers curled slightly against his knees, while Daniel felt something unfamiliar, not fear, not exactly, but a quiet awareness that he had nearly walked forward seconds earlier without noticing anything at all. The security guard beside him shifted his weight, glancing upward now as well, and the city continued moving around them. Footsteps, distant horns, the hum of traffic. Yet in the small space beneath the towering building, time seemed to slow. Marcus leaned forward slightly, still seated, his eyes fixed on the shifting reflection above. while Daniel Whitmore remained still beside him, a billionaire who controlled companies and markets, now waiting quietly beside a man most people would have passed without seeing. Both of them watching the faint shimmer of metal overhead as the wind moved through the street once again. The wind passed again, stronger this time, sliding between the tall glass buildings like a slow, invisible current. And Marcus Reed felt the vibration more clearly now, a faint metallic tremble that traveled down through the structure above them. He shifted slightly, lifting his chin as his eyes locked onto the metal signage panel once more. The sunlight flickered along its edge, uneven and restless, and he noticed something new. One corner no longer aligned perfectly with the bracket that held it in place. The gap was small, barely noticeable to anyone not looking directly at it. But Marcus had spent years studying small misalignments that meant bigger problems later. He leaned forward slightly and spoke quietly again. "Sir, you might want to stay right here for just another second." Daniel Whitmore glanced at him, irritation still faint in his expression but now mixed with cautious curiosity. His security guard stepped forward slightly, uncertain, but Daniel lifted his hand again, stopping him without looking away from the building above. The city noise continued around them. Footsteps, engines, distant conversations, but within that small circle beneath the tower, everything felt slower, more focused. The breeze returned again, brushing across the metal panel, and this time the movement was slightly more visible, a subtle shift, barely an inch, but enough to change the reflection of sunlight across the glass below. Marcus exhaled quietly, his instincts sharpening his years of experience telling him something was loosening gradually, not suddenly, just enough to create uncertainty. Daniel followed the movement now, his eyes narrowing slightly, and he stepped half a foot backward without fully realizing he had done so, his polished shoes scraping softly against the concrete. The security guard noticed the shift and glanced upward as well, his posture tightening. A delivery cyclist passed near the curb, the wheels humming softly against the pavement, and the morning light grew brighter as clouds shifted overhead. Marcus remained seated, calm but alert, his fingers resting loosely against his knees. He had seen this kind of slow shift before, small signs that most people ignored until they passed. He spoke again, his voice steady. "Sometimes things give you a quiet warning before they change." Daniel did not respond, but he remained still, his attention fully upward now. The faint metallic sound returned again, a soft rattle that blended with the wind, and the panel above shifted slightly once more, not dramatically, just enough to confirm what Marcus had sensed. The air cooled briefly as the wind passed again, and the reflection of sunlight danced unevenly along the polished entrance doors. Marcus leaned back slightly, still watching, while Daniel Whitmore stood beside him, silent now, no longer checking his watch, no longer listening to his assistant, simply waiting, as the faint tremor overhead continued, subtle and quiet, while the city moved forward around them, unaware that something small, almost invisible, was slowly changing above their heads. The wind flowed once more through the narrow corridor of glass and steel, cooler now, carrying a faint echo that seemed to linger just above the entrance. Marcus Reed felt it before he heard it, a subtle shift in pressure, the kind that brushed lightly across the skin like the first hint of a coming storm. His eyes remained fixed on the metal panel above, and this time the reflection of sunlight wavered more noticeably along the polished glass doors below. Daniel Whitmore noticed it too, his gaze narrowing as the faint shimmer above caught his attention. He shifted his weight slightly, stepping another half step backward, his polished shoes scraping softly against the concrete. The security guard beside him straightened, now fully alert, his eyes moving upward. The city around them continued in its usual rhythm. A bus exhaled air as it paused at the intersection. A pedestrian checked his watch while crossing the street. A woman adjusted her scarf as she passed, yet beneath the tall tower, the quiet tension thickened. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his posture still calm but focused. He had seen small warnings like this before, years earlier on a job in Milwaukee where a loose bracket had hummed quietly before maintenance crews secured it. He remembered the sound, the same thin metallic vibration carried by wind. Daniel followed the line of Marcus's gaze again, noticing now that one of the support brackets appeared slightly angled, not dramatically, just enough to disturb the clean symmetry of the structure. He felt a faint unease settle in his chest, unfamiliar and quiet. Marcus spoke again softly. "Sir, just stay here a moment longer." Daniel did not answer, but he remained still. His assistant's voice in his earpiece had gone silent after several unanswered prompts, and for the first time that morning, Daniel Whitmore ignored the schedule entirely. The wind brushed again, stronger this time, and the metal panel shifted subtly, not falling, not sudden, just a slight adjustment that created a faint echo of metal against bracket. The sound blended with the passing traffic, but Marcus heard it clearly. His fingers tightened briefly against his knees, then relaxed again, his breathing steady. Daniel noticed the movement now, the faint shift in alignment, and he stepped back. Another few inches, his security guard mirrored the movement instinctively. A delivery van rolled slowly past, sunlight reflecting off its windshield in a bright flash that briefly illuminated the underside of the panel. Marcus watched carefully, his instincts telling him the movement was gradual, controlled by wind pressure and loosened tension, not immediate, but enough to warrant caution. The breeze softened slightly, and the panel settled into a new position, barely different from before, yet enough to confirm what Marcus had sensed from the beginning. Daniel exhaled quietly, realizing he had been holding his breath without noticing. The city noise resumed its normal rhythm: footsteps, engines, distant conversations, and yet Daniel remained still beside Marcus, both men watching the structure above as the wind quieted for a moment, leaving only the faint echo of metal cooling in the morning air, subtle and almost invisible, while the morning sun climbed higher and the reflection across the glass tower steadied once more. The wind faded gradually, leaving behind a quiet stillness that felt heavier than the noise that had come before. Marcus Reed relaxed his shoulders slightly, but kept his eyes lifted toward the metal panel above. He had learned never to assume stability too quickly. Sometimes structures settled before shifting again, and patience often revealed more than urgency. Daniel Whitmore stood beside him, unusually still, his breathing slow, his attention no longer divided between calls and schedules. The glass tower reflected the morning sun in steady bands of light now, and the faint metallic echo had softened into silence. A few pedestrians walked past, glancing briefly at the two men standing together, one in a tailored suit, the other in a worn jacket, an unlikely still frame in the middle of a fast-moving morning. Marcus leaned back slightly, resting his hands loosely on his knees. The cold concrete beneath him felt familiar, grounding. The scent of coffee drifted again from the corner cafe, and a light breeze moved across the street, gentler this time. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension easing from his posture. He adjusted his cuff again, but this time the motion was slower, less automatic, his mind replaying the past few moments, the faint vibration, the shifting reflection, the quiet certainty in Marcus's voice. He glanced down briefly at the man beside him, noticing details he had ignored earlier. The careful way Marcus kept his boots tied, the folded newspaper beside him, arranged neatly, the calm steadiness in his expression, nothing frantic, nothing desperate, just quiet awareness. The security guard shifted beside them, still watching the structure above, then glanced at Daniel for direction. Daniel gave a small nod, not yet moving. The city around them resumed its steady rhythm, engines humming, footsteps tapping, distant horns echoing between buildings. Yet the stillness between the two men lingered. Marcus finally lowered his gaze from the building and looked forward again, his eyes calm, as if the moment had passed but the awareness remained. He spoke softly, not expecting conversation, just stating what felt true. Sometimes the city slows down for a second. Most people just do not notice it. Daniel looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of the words. He had spent years analyzing markets, forecasting risks, controlling outcomes. Yet here was a man who listened to the wind and the quiet shifts of metal. Daniel followed Marcus's gaze forward, watching pedestrians cross the street, sunlight reflecting off windows, a bus pulling away from the curb, the ordinary movement of a morning that had nearly passed unnoticed. He realized he had nearly walked forward minutes earlier, unaware of anything unusual, and that quiet realization settled in his chest. Marcus adjusted his jacket slightly, pulling it closer as the morning breeze returned gently, and the glass tower behind them stood tall and silent, the metal panel now steady, the reflection smooth once again. The moment had passed, but the stillness it left behind lingered quietly, like a breath held and released, while the city moved forward around them, unchanged, yet somehow different for the two men standing side by side. Marcus Reed slowly pushed himself up from the concrete, his knees stiff from the cold ground, and for a moment he simply stood there, looking ahead at the steady flow of people moving toward the glass doors. The morning had returned to its usual rhythm, and it seemed like nothing unusual had happened at all. Daniel Whitmore adjusted his jacket slightly, preparing to continue toward the entrance. His assistant's voice returned faintly in his earpiece, mentioning the meeting waiting upstairs, but Daniel did not move immediately. He glanced once more toward the metal panel above, now steady and quiet, and then back toward Marcus, who had already begun gathering his folded newspaper and adjusting the worn strap of a small canvas bag resting beside him. Marcus did not look at Daniel as he prepared to leave. He simply moved with quiet efficiency, the kind of practiced motion that came from years of living with very little. Daniel hesitated, an unfamiliar pause, as if he wanted to say something but had not yet found the words. Before he could speak, a low voice came from behind them, the security guard speaking into his radio with calm professionalism, requesting building maintenance to check the signage brackets above the entrance. Daniel turned slightly, watching as another guard stepped toward the building in trance and glanced upward, his posture tightening subtly as he studied the panel. Within moments, a building supervisor appeared from inside the lobby, a middle-aged man wearing a navy blazer and carrying a small tablet. He followed the guard's gesture and looked upward, his expression shifting from routine calm to focused attention. He stepped closer to the entrance, studying the alignment of the bracket and the edge of the panel. Marcus noticed the movement, but continued adjusting his bag. The supervisor spoke quietly into his phone, requesting a maintenance team to inspect the mounting hardware. Daniel watched silently, realizing the shift in tone, the subtle urgency in the supervisor's voice. A few minutes later, two maintenance workers arrived with safety helmets and a compact ladder cart. They positioned themselves carefully near the entrance, glancing upward as they prepared to inspect the bracket more closely. One of them tilted his head, studying the slight angle of the support mount, and then nodded to his colleague, who began setting up the ladder. Daniel felt a quiet confirmation settle in his chest, the faint unease from earlier replaced by clarity. Marcus had not imagined the subtle shift. It had been real, measurable, and now the building staff were responding to it. The supervisor stepped back slightly, continuing to watch the process. The morning sun reflected off the glass tower, and pedestrians slowed briefly as they noticed the maintenance activity. Marcus slung the canvas bag over his shoulder and began to step away, blending naturally into the flow of people along the sidewalk. Daniel turned quickly, noticing him leaving, the man who had quietly noticed what others had missed, and for the first time that morning, Daniel Whitmore spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Wait." Marcus paused mid-step, turning slightly, his expression calm and curious, while behind them the maintenance workers carefully inspected the bracket above, confirming the small misalignment that had gone unnoticed before, and the city continued moving forward, unaware that a quiet moment of attention had just prevented something small from becoming something larger. Marcus Reed paused and turned slowly, his canvas bag resting against his shoulder, his expression calm and unreadable. Daniel Whitmore stepped toward him, the polished leather of his shoes catching the morning light, the contrast between them striking yet quiet. Daniel hesitated for a brief moment, as if adjusting to a conversation he rarely had. Then he spoke with a measured tone. "You noticed something that my entire security team and building staff did not." Marcus gave a small shrug, not dismissive, just simple. "Sometimes you hear things when you spend enough time outside." Daniel studied him more closely now, noticing the calm steadiness in his eyes, the absence of expectation. Marcus did not ask for anything, did not step closer. He simply stood there waiting. Behind them, the maintenance workers adjusted the ladder carefully and examined the bracket. One of them gently tapped the support mount and then nodded to his colleague, confirming the slight looseness that required tightening. The supervisor watched with quiet focus, speaking briefly into his phone. Daniel followed the scene for a moment, then looked back at Marcus. "You used to work in maintenance, did not you?" Marcus nodded slightly. "High-rise buildings, mostly downtown. Years ago." Daniel tilted his head, surprised by the calm confidence in the response. "Why did you stop?" Marcus looked briefly toward the street, watching a bus pull away from the curb, then answered quietly, "Life changes, sometimes faster than you expect." Daniel did not press further. Something in Marcus's tone suggested a story that did not need to be explained. The wind moved gently again, softer now, and the reflection across the glass tower remained steady. The maintenance worker reached upward and began tightening the bracket carefully. Daniel watched the movement and then turned back toward Marcus. "I appreciate what you did." Marcus gave another small nod. "It was nothing, just paying attention." Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and paused, then slowly pulled out a business card. He held it for a moment, then extended it toward Marcus. "If you ever want to talk about work again, call this number." Marcus looked at the card briefly but did not take it immediately. His eyes moved from the card to Daniel's face, as if weighing the sincerity of the gesture. Daniel did not rush. He simply held the card steady. Marcus finally accepted it, holding it carefully between his fingers. "Daniel Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer." The card read in clean silver lettering. Marcus slid the card into his jacket pocket without comment. "Thank you," he said quietly. Daniel nodded once. Behind them, the maintenance worker finished adjusting the bracket and stepped down from the ladder, giving a small thumbs up to the supervisor, who exhaled slightly, the subtle tension lifting from his posture. The panel above now sat aligned and secure, sunlight reflecting smoothly across the glass once again. Marcus shifted his bag and stepped backward slightly, preparing to leave. Daniel watched him, realizing the man was already moving on, blending naturally into the morning crowd. Marcus turned and walked along the sidewalk, his steps unhurried, the city flowing around him as if he had always been part of its rhythm. Daniel remained standing near the entrance, watching until Marcus disappeared into the movement of commuters, the business card now resting quietly in a worn jacket pocket. And above them the secured metal panel caught the morning sunlight, steady and silent, while the city carried on. Daniel Whitmore stood quietly outside the glass entrance long after Marcus Reed disappeared into the movement of the morning crowd. The reflection of sunlight stretched across the polished floor behind him, and for a moment the world around him seemed unusually still. His security team shifted slightly nearby, waiting for him to proceed inside. But Daniel remained where he was, his gaze drifting toward the street where Marcus had walked. The city continued its rhythm. Taxis rolled past. Footsteps echoed softly against concrete. The scent of fresh coffee floated through the cool air, yet something in Daniel's posture had changed. A subtle calm replacing the urgency that usually defined his mornings. He adjusted his jacket slowly and finally stepped inside the lobby. The quiet hum of the building wrapped around him, marble floors reflecting soft light from the high windows. His assistant approached quickly with a tablet, her voice careful. "The board is waiting upstairs, sir." Daniel nodded but paused, his eyes briefly lifting toward the glass ceiling. Sunlight filtered through, steady and calm. He stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft sound. And as the elevator rose floor by floor, Daniel's reflection stared back at him from the polished steel walls, his expression thoughtful, less guarded than usual. He remembered the quiet certainty in Marcus's voice, the calm patience, the way he had simply noticed what others missed. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 27th floor. The doors opened, and Daniel stepped into the conference hallway. Executives stood waiting, conversations paused as he entered. But Daniel moved more slowly than usual, his mind still anchored to the quiet moment outside. Later that morning, after meetings concluded and decisions were made, Daniel returned to his office. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city below, traffic moving like quiet streams of motion. He stood near the glass, his eyes scanning the street far below, searching without fully realizing it. The metal panel above the entrance gleamed steadily in the sunlight, secure and aligned. The moment had passed, but the awareness remained. Daniel turned toward his desk and pressed a small button on his intercom. Contact building management and asked them to provide the names of maintenance contractors in the area. He paused briefly, then added, "And check nearby shelters as well." His assistant acknowledged quietly. Daniel rested his hands lightly against the desk. The city stretched out beyond the glass, vast and busy, yet he felt grounded by something simple. Someone had paid attention when no one else had. Hours later, as afternoon light softened across the skyline, Marcus Reed sat quietly on a bench 2 blocks away, the business card resting carefully in his jacket pocket. He did not take it out. He simply felt its presence, a small piece of possibility carried quietly with him. The breeze moved gently through the street, carrying distant sounds of traffic and conversation. Marcus looked up briefly at the sky reflected between the tall buildings, calm and open, and then he lowered his gaze, standing slowly. Adjusting his canvas bag once more, he stepped forward into the moving crowd, blending naturally into the rhythm of the city, while far above, sunlight reflected steadily across the glass tower, the secured metal panel silent. The morning's quiet warning now part of a story that lingered only in the awareness of 2 men who had paused long enough to listen. And the city continued forward, unchanged yet quietly different, carried by wind, light, and the stillness that sometimes appears when someone chooses to notice.